Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome SUD Talk speaker, Dr. Elaine Rotenberg.
When I think about denial and mental illness, I'm reminded of the casserole story. Maybe some of you have heard it. It's the story of two mothers, each running back and forth day in and day out, visiting their child in the hospital. One child recovering from a suicide attempt. The other child recovering from injuries from a near-fatal car accident. The difference between those two mothers can be summed up in one word: casserole. For the mother whose child was in the car accident, there was casserole and dinner and flowers and candy delivered every night. For the mother whose child had made a suicide attempt, there was nothing. No one knew that that child was in the hospital. No one knew why that child had missed 4 days of school that week. No one knew that that child had a mental illness. As a society, we don't like to talk about mental illness. We would rather talk about a family member with cancer or heart disease or diabetes than talk about our family member with schizophrenia or bipolar disorder or major depression or any other mental illness. Maybe it's the word mental. Maybe it's shame. Maybe it's a belief that somehow that illness is our fault. But here I am on an evening focused on substance use disorders, wanting to shine a light on the prevalence of mental illness in our community. Why is that? Because regardless of our discomfort and dis-ease with mental illness, there is no avoiding the fact that people with mental illness are more likely to experience a substance use disorder than people without a mental illness. You know, the numbers speak for themselves. 1 out of 4 individuals has a mental illness. Of those, 18% have a substance use disorder, compared to 6% without a mental illness. And it works the other way, too. Of the 20 million adults in the United States with a substance use disorder, 50% of them will have a co-occurring mental illness. Not talking about mental illness does not make it go away. Not talking about mental illness simply means that people will not get an appropriate diagnosis, people will not get directed to an appropriate treatment, but guess what? People will continue to suffer with the symptoms of their untreated, undiagnosed mental illness, and they will look for ways to cope, often turning to alcohol and drugs to ease the pain of their anxiety and depression and to dull the voices that just won't go away. And then the cycle has begun, and which came first really doesn't matter. What matters is the inextricable link between mental illness and substance use. Why are communities so much happier denying mental illness than addressing the issue head on? Maybe it's because by looking away, we can avoid taking responsibility for the lack of affordable treatments in our communities. Or maybe by looking away, we can avoid the pain of our own mental illness or that of our family or neighbors. Or maybe by looking away, we can pretend that mental illness is someone else's problem. But continuing to deny simply perpetuates myths about mental illness. Let me give you a few examples. Myth number 1, people with mental illness are responsible for most of the violent crimes in our communities. Is that true? No. The fact is, people with mental illness are 10 times more likely to be the victim of a crime rather than the perpetrator. Somebody about suicide. It will make them more likely to make a suicide attempt. Is that true? No. Fact is, if you talk to somebody about suicide, it might save their life. Myth number 3, mental illness does not affect children. Is that true? Absolutely not. The fact is, more than 50% of adult mental illness begins before the age of 14, yet less than 1/3 of those kids get appropriate treatment. You know, busting through myths like these might be as simple as teaching ordinary citizens through initiatives like mental health first aid, that turning towards someone and not running away from someone with a mental illness can save a life. Mental illness is an illness. It is a treatable illness. So who are the real afflicted? Those who are diagnosed? I think not. I think that that label belongs to the individuals and communities that continue to deny and shun and stigmatize mental illness. You remember that boy whose mother did not receive casserole? Perhaps if someone had recognized his anxiety and depression years before, he would not have been in that hospital bed in the first place. Imagine how much better the lives of that boy, his mother, his family, and our communities would be if we replaced our denial of mental illness with affirmation, treatment, support, and hope. Thank you.
I'd like to build the world.